Good evening. It's 6 o'clock, so we begin. I request all of you to mute yourself. And Samriddha and Sai Kiran, please help. If somebody is not able to, you can mute them.
Sure.
Let me first welcome our distinguished speaker for today, Ambassador Akbaruddin. A lot of your old buddies are here, as you can see, and quite a number of people from HPS are expected to join as well. Just a few basic rules for this meeting. During the meeting, as usual, please keep yourself muted. And I would also recommend that you switch off your video in order to preserve the bandwidth so all of us can hear the speaker, clearly and without interrupting him. Please do not switch on your audio during the presentation of the speaker. As you know that this meeting is significant for FOSWL Hyderabad because we have just completed 12 years of uninterrupted monthly meetings. And as many new people are here, I should mention that this is basically a forum for senior citizens. And we have a lot of youngsters, of course, also who attend, as you can see. But essentially, it is to recognize that in today's time and age, the elderly are still active, well-educated, very experienced. They are a wealth to the nation, and we need to interact and engage them in nation building. And that is the objective with which FOSWL was started in Cupertino, California, over 20 years ago by Mr. M.L. Swamy, the first engineering chief of the then combined Andhra Pradesh. And Hyderabad chapter is the second chapter and the first global chapter of FOSWL. So with that, without much ado, let's start. And I'd like to invite Samriddha Ghosh to read the prayer to kick off our meeting. Samriddha.
Hi, everybody. Yes, it's heaven of freedom, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where the knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where the words come out from the depths of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake.
Thank you, Samriddha. May I now call upon, just to give you some context to this, every monthly meeting of FOSWL is an endowment set up in the name of somebody to celebrate their life and work. This month's meeting is to honor the life and work of Mr. Jagan Mohan Rao Yarneni. And the logistics sponsorship is from Mrs. U. Manorama Rao. May I now call upon Ms. Usha to say a few words about her father, Mr. Jagan Mohan Rao. Ms. Usha. Chakradhar, are you there? Well, looks like they had some difficulty joining. Mr. Jagan Mohan Rao started his career with HAL. He's an engineer who worked with them, did some yeoman service, and later left and started his own private enterprise. What makes him stand out is in post his retirement, his active life, he set up a hostel for talented, brilliant, but economically weak children right here in Hyderabad in Vengal Rao Nagar area. So what they would do is they would go around all the government schools every year and select students with merit, invite them to join their hostel where they are provided everything, literally everything, and they are groomed to be, good citizens. Want of money would not come in their way. They are coached like their own children, and several years he's been doing this from his personal funds. So it's a great effort he has mounted, and he and his wife have done yeoman work. So we always commend him and congratulate him. In every January meeting, we remember his good work. I'd also like to speak about Mrs. U. Manorama Rao, in whose name his son, Dr. U. Ravi Rao, has set up a logistic sponsorship for this month. A very versatile person. I've personally known her. She recently passed away at the ripe age of 102. Her life's journeys encompassed 2 centenaries. She was born on 8th October 1917 to a High Court advocate in Madras, Mr. Tombat Anand Rao. And amazing, in those days, she studied in the famous Queen Mary's College and stood first in English literature, bagging the Kripabai Satyanathan Gold Medal for all the 4 southern states at that time. And that was not the end. She went on to pursue her BA Honours in English Literature in that prestigious Presidency College. And there also she received the Grieg Memorial Gold Medal. And it was not just academics, and I've seen this personally. She took part in every form of cultural activities such as drama, debates, and excelled in all of them. And she was a photographic enthusiast, photographer in those days. And subsequently, she married Mr. U. Narayan Rao, a barrister from England, who did his legal studies in England and who retired as the additional law secretary in the then, earlier it was Mysore, then Karnataka. Dr. Ravi Rao is the oldest son. He is with us in this meeting. He is a former director of Warner Lambert. Dr. Who is an eminent cardiologist based in Chicago, and Wing Commander Ranjit Rao, retired. He's a distinguished Air Force officer who's now living in Cincinnati. So she had a full life, and this meeting, we remember and pay tribute to her life as well. So that's about the people we are honoring and celebrating this month. Now we are all eagerly waiting to hear about Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin. And as many of you know, he has his roots in Hyderabad. He went to the Hyderabad Public School and passed out in 1977, if I'm correct, or if I remember his rightly. And he subsequently went to complete his graduation from Nizam College and then Delhi University. And he has joined the Indian Foreign Service and distinguished himself in every position that he served over the years. More recently, I think all of us, or quite a number of us, remember the remarkable way that he has represented India in various fora, in very ticklish and tricky situations. And he was also the official spokesman for the Ministry of External Affairs from 2012 to 15. And that's when he's credited with having extensively used the social media tools to expand public diplomacy outreach. So we are very delighted to have Ambassador Akbaruddin speak to us today on the relevance of the United Nations in today's fast-changing geopolitical system. Welcome, Ambassador Akbaruddin. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Subbarao Garu, for providing me this opportunity to engage with all of you. Opportunity to meet some of my old friends, to make some new friends. I must say I'm overwhelmed by the idea that permeates your organization, the Friends on Same Wavelength, FOSWL. It's an extremely attractive thought which underpins this venture that you have started. Desiring to be intellectually active is a theme that reverberates with many these days. The zest that senior citizens can bring, their knowledge and experience is something that all of us should tap into. Although we are, as a country, on the wrong side of the majority, because 65% of our population is 35 and less. But I must congratulate you for the efforts that you are putting in over such a long time, more than 12 years, in promoting the lives and remembering those who have contributed in their unique ways to society. And I'm grateful that you provided me an opportunity today as we commemorate the services of Shri Jagan Mohan Rao and Mrs. Manorama Rao for their services to their community. So it's for me an honor. I must say, when I was listening to all these thoughts of people coming in, a sort of old Urdu poem struck me. I actually am not very good at any form of poetry, English, Urdu, or Telugu. But this poem, for some reason, seems to have struck me when you were talking of seniors. It was written, I think, almost 100 years ago by Urdu poet Iqbal in pre-independent India. And it goes something like, सितारों से आगे जहां और भी है, अभी इश्क के इम्तिहान और भी है. It basically means that there lie worlds beyond the stars. There are still tests of love beyond you. And for those who are from the Hyderabad public school, there are verses from this poem which will reverberate with you because it refers to the eaglet or eagle Shaheen. Tu Shaheen hai, parwaz hai, kaam tera. Tere samne asman aur bhi hai. It basically says that you are an eagle and to soar is your nature. You have many more spaces ahead of you. The point I would like to make is that even as change happens, opportunities arise and there are people utilizing those opportunities well beyond what they think they could contribute to. And this resonated with me because of the way in which you have paid tribute to several senior citizens at this forum. In a way, today's discussion is also about a senior citizen, the United Nations, which is 75 years old and counting, whether it is relevant or not in the current geopolitical mosaic. So what I will do is try to formulate my thoughts under three broad rubrics. What is the state of the United Nations? What accounts for its present state? And what is next? I will try and keep a broad framework and leave any individual specific questions that you have to respond to if you raise those. In my initial presentation, I'll speak for about 25 minutes or so and try and keep to put this in a broad framework rather than country specific or incident specific. But once I finish that, if you have any questions on anything, either on the United Nations or anything linked with that that I can answer, I will try to do so to the best of my ability. Well, starting with the United Nations, if it's 75 years old, it is obviously a resilient organization. It's perhaps one of the most resilient organizations of its type because its predecessor, the League of Nations, survived 20 years. The United Nations has survived for about 75 years now. So obviously it is 50 years older than the previous experiment of its kind. But if you go back to the idea on which the United Nations is based, of multilateralism, of international organizations, that idea is about 200 years old. It started, I would think, in 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars. The Congress of Vienna was called for in Europe among the victorious powers of Europe, and they looked for a continuing organization which can address issues of peace and security in Europe. Now, of course, we can pull back and say there were other such organizations in the past individually, perhaps they were. But rather than being a historian, I was largely a practitioner. So I look at the world today, drawing its roots from what is a continuous process rather than a longer process which may be of use, which may be similar, but where we can't draw exact parallels. So you'll have to understand that to me, international organizations are something like 200 years old. Initially, they dealt with peace and security, as I said, was the occasion to start this Congress of Vienna. And it was followed by other congresses, 4 others, I think, leading up to 1825, etc. And then there was a spurt of organizations dealing with technical matters, like the International Telegraphic Union, the Universal Postal Union, the International Association for Railway Transport, etc., etc. Now, these are broadly what we would call, in today's parlance, organizations of low politics. They were technical in nature. There is no such international organization where there is no politics. It's low politics or perhaps high politics, but without politics, there is no interstate organization. So those who think that the WHO or the International Atomic Energy Agency or other technical organizations are without any politics, that's certainly not correct, because they may be of low politics in some cases, but now these days, everything is political, including the WHO, which is caught up in one of the biggest political controversies of recent times. So basically, my point is that over the 200-year period, international organizations have developed, and the United Nations is a culmination of that development. But in that 200 years, there have been many organizations. In fact, by an assessment, there were more than about 550 plus international organizations during this period, of whom about 39% didn't survive. So the survival rate of international organizations is not a given. It's about 61% or so. So we need to understand that institutions with human beings built are not God's gift. They can wither away or die away if they are not nurtured or if they don't serve a purpose. So that's the background in which we need to keep as we look to both the resilience of this organization as well as the fallibility of this organization, because both are possible. It's up to human beings to either nurture it or to decide to move away from it. And that's the background of such organizations over a 200 plus year period. Now, while the UN was started in the post-World War period, the idea was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And since then, the UN's role has developed in areas which were not envisaged at the beginning. into various areas of global governance. It has many achievements, many shortcomings. Certainly, the shortcoming that is most obvious is that it has not saved succeeding generations from the scourge of war. There have been, by various calculations, more than 800 plus wars of different types since the UN was established after World War II. And by this account, it's not been a success because it's allowed so many wars, skirmishes, etc., to proliferate. And if its focus is on peace and security, then it has fallen short of that focus. On the other hand, there is a contrarian argument that the UN's vision was not so much as taking mankind to heaven, but as saving mankind from hell. And perhaps in that, it has been somewhat successful because there has not been a nuclear conflagration of the sort that was envisaged at the time in the initial years of the UN. Also, the agenda of the UN has grown in ways which was never envisaged at the inception. There are issues now such as environmental protection, pandemics, HIV/AIDS, COVID-19 now, issues relating to global commons, Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. All these are newer ideas which nobody thought in 45 that you need to address, but the UN has provided a platform for accommodation of these issues as they have emerged. And therefore, it's a resilient organization. If you ask old-time UN diplomats and officials what is the most successful aspect of the UN, they will say that the UN has saved millions of lives by immunizing children through the UNICEF against infectious diseases. Indeed, the work of the specialized agencies of the UN is something that has contributed to the welfare of mankind. And but for that, the glass would have been perhaps not half empty, but fully empty. Well, whether you say that the glass is half empty and some say the glass is half full, depending on the reasons for saying so, it's pretty clear that the glass needs refilling. Some say that the glass, even if it's refilled, cannot fulfill your needs, and therefore it needs to be changed. Be that as it may, the present circumstances are clearly one in which nobody is satisfied. Some say that the UN has plateaued, some say that it's declined, some say it's on the decline, but nobody says that it is fulfilling the promise that it held in 1945. Now, you can look at what could, and that's a given. No one, even its strongest supporters, don't say that no, nothing needs to change. You can look at what could be the causes of the plateauing or the stagnation or the decline. And depending on where you are and how you think, you will have different views about it. But it's useful to quickly recollect what are the reasons for it to plateau or to stagnate or to decline. One obvious reason that comes to everybody is that those who invested in it initially are not any longer investing in this venture with the same zest and fervor. And what comes to mind is the United States under President Trump. Systematically, it has denuded its support for international organizations in general and the United Nations in particular. And you can list out a series of instances that can prove this point. But that said, that's one aspect. And there are some who say now with the new administration, things will change and we'll be back to where we were. But a new normal is not going to be where you left off. Because in the meantime, there have been new assertions of authority and power. And so The second reason that some give is that the greater assertiveness of countries like China, who are flexing their muscles in a way that was not anticipated previously. You can again give various reasons and explanations. For example, the Chinese now pay more than all the next 3 permanent members together. So the US pays the highest amount of contributions to the UN, which is about 25%, 22% of the regular budget. The Chinese pay about 11%. Russia, France, and UK combined pay less than that. So obviously, those who are now asked to contribute more are asking also for their pound of flesh. And that's the reason that you have the Chinese being more assertive, wanting to insert Xi Jinping thought into UN processes, talking of greater accommodation of their views, greater representation for their personnel. They argue that they have a centralized leadership, unified command, and they are able to coordinate their action much better than the others. And therefore, they are able to muster quantitative majorities, and they should be accommodated. Their goal is to pour, they say, new wine in old bottles. They say the UN needs new wine. China is ready to provide that. They have the capacity, the intellectual heft, and they should be accommodated. That's a second viewpoint of why the stagnation, decline, conflict, contestation that is happening globally. A third view is that, gone are the days of only big powers dominating. The world is moving towards multipolarity, towards multi-stakeholderism, towards multiplication of issues and multi-layered governance. And therefore, all these multiple needs will have to be accommodated. The current system doesn't accommodate them, and therefore the need for change. They talk of the rise of pluralism, saying that, well, yes, China and the US are important, but so is Japan with about 8% contribution to the UN budget. So is Germany with about 7% contribution to the UN budget. So are newer countries who are asserting or re-emerging on the international scene, like India, like Brazil, like South Africa. Then there are new issues which the current structures are not capable of handling, whether it is climate change, whether it is information and data related issues, issues of global governance of outer space, issues of ungoverned spaces like the Arctic and the Antarctic. All these are newer areas. Also, states are no longer the only actors. There are states who are the primary actors, of course, but there are new actors. For example, people say if you have to look at data or cybersecurity or information, you have to bring onto the table Google or Amazon, because they are the ones who bring whatever is onto your smartphones. States have a role which is gradually diminishing in that. Then there are others who say, well, there are a lot of intergovernmental agencies at a regional level, not in our part of the world, but in Europe, for example. The EU plays a greater role than many individual governments do. The African Union is increasingly playing an important role in peace and security. ASEAN and is working towards regional integration and connectivity in ways that we never anticipated before. So there is a new level which also needs to be accommodated. All these are not now being recognized and accommodated, and therefore, even if the US comes back, even if the US under President Biden makes an effort to re-engage very strongly, that era is gone. We now need to look at the new era and see how it can be adjusted to the new realities. Now, with this situation, what are the options that are available? Again, the options that you will look at are the options which determine your philosophical outlook. So if you are a realist in international relations, you will say that international organizations are created and maintained by powerful states in order to advance their national interest. And institutions merely reflect the states of primary interest of powerful states. Institutional change is expected to mirror either the shifting constellations of power or changes in the interests of the system's most powerful states. And therefore, the current international system does not reflect that, and therefore it will decline, it will decay, whatever you do to try and stop it. There may be a time lag. It may take some time. The present system may endure for some time, but if no amount of investment in it will lead to a change, because we are now in a different era, an era of global power competition rather than cooperation, era of multiple power, multipolarity, multiple power centers trying to emerge, jostling for space. And the era where you felt that states would be responsible stakeholders and they will work together with a common liberal vision is over. So get ready for an international order that is messy, which is nasty, which is chaotic, and where states will have to plan for a life akin to what Thomas Hobbes said, that life will be solitary, poor, nasty, short, and brutish. It's not an appealing situation, but that's what realists think, that the UN is over. This 200-year experiment, which kept on moving, has reached its maximum possible boundaries. We will go back to an era before the UN. That's how states behaved. That's how states were. They will pursue their national interests, whether in vaccines or in healthcare or in political matters. That's what will dominate, and that's what is life going to be in the next few years. It's only a matter of time. The time frame can, of course, be argued. Then there is a second viewpoint, which is of liberal internationalists who say that, actually the crises are all reflecting how much interconnected the world is. And all countries, all states, all humans are in the same boat. We will prosper or suffer together. You can only be in good shape if your partner is not in bad shape. So either you work with your partner or pray that your partner is in good shape, because only then will you be in good shape. So basically the argument is that we sink or swim together. If the boat has sprung a leak, we need to plug it. Otherwise, we will all sink. That's the liberal internet. So what do they suggest? So they say that the fragility of interconnectedness of our globalized world shows that we are all vulnerable to external shocks, and we need more of an effective rule-based multilateral system, which is the world's best insurance policy against such existential threats as pandemics, climate change, nuclear weapons. And the cost of failing is so awful that we need to persevere. Problems without passports, which cross boundaries, will continue, and therefore the 200-year-old liberal project needs to be strengthened rather than undermined or dispensed with. So that's a second group of thinking of liberal intellectuals who are keen that the current order is strengthened, persevered with, enhanced, rather than done away with. And then there is a third view of the structuralists. They say that the institutions are getting weaker because the world is changing quickly, and therefore there is need for structural reform. And the present structures are not keeping up with the requirements. And so unless you change the structures, your needs will not be met. They talk of climate change, geoengineering, pandemics, ungoverned spaces, digital, cybersecurity, outer space, polar regions. I mean, you can have a very broad band of issues where conversations are needed. Now, for these, they say that cooperation by internationally agreed mechanisms is required. These are not issues which are amenable to individual national solutions by themselves, because these are problems of modernity. The changes in the development in science, of industry, of technology are forcing us to go beyond borders and work together. If you don't work, you will not be able to tackle these problems. And so they say, while you need not be very prescriptive about how you go about promoting international cooperation, whether it's the UN or others, etc., you need fora for international cooperation. You need multilateral organizations of some bent or the other to try and address these problems of modernity. And of course, the rivalry between states will preoccupy the world, and the problems of anarchy cannot be wished away, but so can't the problems of modernism be wished away. We cannot simply hide within our borders when faced with such problems of modernity, and hope that these will go away if we close our borders. Today, some problems can go away by closing your borders, but some problems will find ways even if you close your borders. And because the emergent, interconnected, and cascading transnational dangers are such that there is a case for a decent, cooperative world order that encourages competitive pursuit of national interests. So they try and find a structural solution to what is a clearly inadequate situation at present. Now, there are no clear pathways from all these. You can choose one or the other from any of these, or you may have a mixture of all three. If you are looking for a new order, is it so easy to build a new order replacing something which has been there for 75 years? Can we look at issue-based coalitions rather than UN-sponsored ones? Do we need to be inclusive? How do we integrate multiple stakeholders as business and not as civil society organizations? Who will be our partners in this coalition? These are all things that we need to look at because the issue of stress of multilateralism is not going to go away. And you have to work on a longer term approach of a strategy of getting from where we are to where we want to be. And that is one for all of you to think, to contribute, because many of you have experience of many issues from different perspectives. And so I will leave that thought with you, because multilateralism will continue. And if 2020 has taught us anything, it has taught us that countries need to act early, and that postponing inevitably leads to protracted agony. It is like trying to keep a motorway open after a sort of a pileup and hoping that drivers will swerve and avoid debris, rather than shutting down the road and clearing it so that traffic can flow normally. The belief is that further collisions simply produce more debris, more casualty, and eventually the road will have to be shut anyway, and it will take longer and much more cost to clear and put it back in order. So these are all things that we need to think through There are no easy answers for those. I certainly am not a sage on the stage to provide those answers, but I look forward to engaging with you and seeing whether collectively there can be some suggestions that we put forth. Thank you very much for providing me this opportunity to talk. Of necessity, I've kept it general, but as I said, I'm ready to answer any specific questions or individual situations about India and the UN or anything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Akbaruddin. It was very nice. You make a difficult subject sound very easy. I'm sure you handled many more tricky situations. So folks, as Samrita has been encouraging you, please put in your questions in the chat box. Let me start with a couple of them, and I'll be helped in this by Samrita. We'll alternate so that he has a look at them as well. One general question, Akbar, is are organizations like United Nations necessary or relevant at all? Because human history says there has never been a period of complete peace. In spite of United Nations or its predecessor world organizations being in existence, there have always been wars in the modern world and in the ancient civilizations. Is it in the DNA of the human race itself? Conflict, is it in the DNA itself? It's one part of it. And I'd like to add one more because it is related to this. And this is asked by Mr. C. Kutumrao, the former vice chairman of the planning board of Andhra Pradesh, New Andhra Pradesh. He says the call for reinvigorated multilateralism, it is coming at a time of reinvigorated nationalism in many parts of the world. And great power rivalries gripping the Security Council as we have been seeing in recent times. In fact, yesterday, your successor, I saw a video, when I think the flag presentation ceremony or something was there, and I was watching what he was saying. What changes can we expect from the UN to reinvent itself in this context? So is UN relevant at all given the supposed DNA of human race? And nationalism, how does it fit into the United Nations? Samrita, you can be prepared for the next question.
Okay, so I understand the thinking that is underpinning this question is realist thinking, that it's in the DNA of human beings to fight. And that is an argument that has been made before. The argument is that if you take away all weapons from people, they will fight with stones. You take away stones, they will fight with hands and kill each other. So it stems from a belief in human nature, which is Hobbesian, that human nature by definition is not possible to control because it's not the milk of kindness that flows from human beings, but a visceral desire to dominate. This is a thinking, but it has not stopped anybody from saying, let us limit some of the bad activities that we all try to do. It's like Rousseau saying that we are all law-abiding because there's a policeman around the corner. But still, that hasn't stopped us from having policemen around the corner. As human beings, we also have an aspirational side. We also have a side that we feel that human nature, even if it is a difficult proposition, has helped humanity progress. So, in historical terms, the times that we are living in are perhaps the most prosperous times for human beings. If you see whether in terms of human health, the facilities available, human wealth, you can measure by many, many metrics and you will still find that there has been progression in human life. That progression could not have come if we had abandoned everything. So my point is, yes, Despite the difficulties of how human beings behave, there are options and there is hope, because human nature is not black and white. To think that only darkness emanates from human beings, then there's no aspiration in life. Forget about after 60, even before 60, we shouldn't be worried about how the world goes, because we know what is going to come out of it. So I won't take such a negative approach of the DNA of human beings being what it is. Yes, nationalism is a factor, but nationalism is not new to international politics. Nationalism led to World War II. It doesn't mean to say that they didn't work on a international organization after World War II, despite nationalism leading to both World War I, which was called an imperialist war by many thinkers, and World War II, because Germany felt that it is just being undermined in such ways which were not acceptable to us. So despite the factors of nationalism, despite the factors of human being not all being the milk of kindness, there are examples of history where things have worked. And I don't think as aspirational societies, we should give that aspiration, irrespective of instances of the past where this has happened, because you can also quote instances of a contrarian nature.
Yeah. Hi, Mr. Akbaruddin. Yeah, the next question comes from Mir Mustafa Ali Hassan. He asks, the UN has been calling on all humanity to work towards and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. There has been a significant progress on them, but he wants to know, from an insider's view, are governments working towards the SDGs with the same enthusiasm as the UN, or is it just a brand to bank upon? Mir Mustafa is an HPS alumni as well. He's a much more recent alumnus. He's interested in the UN. He's been doing Model United Nations. He's probably one of the younger ones on this group today. He had this question. Yeah.
So that's a good question. Coming from a young man, at least he doesn't have a dark view of human nature. So there is hope for all of us. That said, the SDGs are a broad rubric, but many governments, including ours, are working towards the same goal without calling them SDGs. So you may call them by a different name. You may not want to give them the name of SDGs, but globally, there is a concerted effort. Now, whether the concerted effort is enough? No, because everybody always has the challenge of finances. And it is a difficult task to allocate those finances, which are finite in nature, for goals which are extremely ambitious to fulfill. So I don't think governments are not making the effort. They are making, but sometimes factors beyond what they plan for intercede. For example, who anticipated a pandemic of the sort that we are in right now? How much of global resources have been diverted to this and several other issues? Like I heard that even while now we are focusing on pandemic vaccines as a necessity and an urgent requirement, there are other sort of vaccinations, for example, for polio, that are of necessity going to be adversely impacted. And that's the balance that you have to strike. For countries like ours, which have 400 million people below poverty line, it's a greater challenge. But I don't think it's a challenge where you can blame governments, because it's a challenge of resources, and you will always have differences of views on whether the allocation of resources is appropriate or not. Any way you make it, you will always find an alternate option available. And it's a judgment call rather than a call of saying that consciously governments haven't done that.
Combine a few questions, Ambassador Akbaruddin, for the next. They're similar. the questions were around a doubt that individual nations which support United Nations being more powerful. I think the reference obviously is to the US, China now, and others. Can UN ever be truly independent and capable of enforcing its resolutions or decisions? Because it's not been able to enforce some of the decisions. That is one. And probably a related thing is the current challenges, like you mentioned, which were not envisaged when United Nations was initially conceived, like climate change and global terrorism. Can it be really addressed by an organization like UN? Because self-serving attitude of even the nations which perpetuate it are a part of it. They all of you sit at the same table.
So if your point is that the UN is, can it move towards global government? No, because the global trend is towards further decentralization rather than global government. So let's not first create a caricature and say, oh, you will fail because you didn't do A, B, C, D. I don't think the effort is towards global government. All those who work at the UN are fairly conscious of the resurgence of nationalism or even subnationalism and even below that. So that's not the goal, to have a global government, and therefore we should not create goals and ambitions which are not going to be fulfilled. If your answer is, if your question is that, you know, the UN could not solve issues because big powers didn't have the willingness, yes, in most cases. But I can give you instances where even veto-wielding powers lost out. So look at 1956, the Suez Canal invasion. France and UK, both permanent members, landed troops in the Suez Canal. Yet, they were not able to proceed further and withdrew because there was such global consternation against it. So there are examples, and you may say, well, this may not suit here, there, now, etc. This is a debatable thing, but there are examples of big powers even falling back if they don't work out. Russia invaded Afghanistan, it had to move back. There are instances of concerted action which sometimes lead to not worsening of the situation. So let's not totally give up on individual effort, saying that, well, this is how the world is, this is what it will be, I wouldn't want to do anything, and the UN cannot do anything, etc. Now, about big powers wanting a stake, sure. Why will they not want? Many of you do business. If you are a 25% stakeholder, do you want the same authority as a 1% stakeholder? No. You will always want more, and it's understandable that you will want more. Only thing is, you will have to calibrate it with others. So the greater the diffusion of power, the more difficult it is for one country to push and get it. So why should the US be wanting to pay 25%, are being asked to pay 25%, and a country like India paying 0.8%? Yes, today we are happy because we pay less, but is that a recipe for wanting greater authority in global terms when you pay less than 1% and you say, well, no, I want to be equal to somebody who pays 22% or 24%. So there has to be greater equity. Before you ask for greater equity, you should also be willing to contribute, not exactly in equal amount, but in greater amounts, if that is what you feel will help you as a country grow. And for countries like India, international cooperation, there is little scope for making quantum leaps. We need quantum leaps more than those big powers need quantum leaps. For example, when we were in school, the calculation was it would take India 125 years for all Indians to get telephones. came the mobile phone. Now every Indian has 2 telephones. So quantum leaps are in our favor, and we need to invest in those quantum leaps and put in a little bit more, hoping that the future is ours. If we think as a country of 1.3 billion, our trajectory will only increase, then we must invest more in trying to gain more at a later stage. Without investment, you won't get it.
All right. The next question is actually, I'm combining a couple of questions. There have been similar questions around the same point. One is, in your opinion, how realistically can we expect India to get a seat at the Security Council, a permanent seat? And second is, on the similar note, a veto power assigned to members of the UN Security Council appear to be exercised with narrow political consideration. There are concerns around this in the chat section. So is there any possibility to curb the use, or probably what are the, if you could probably explain a little more as to when can a nation use the veto power, or probably is there any limitation? And yeah, just at the end, what are the expectations of probably India getting this permanent seat? Yeah.
I think both are very relevant questions. On the permanent seat, I always used to tell my colleagues that I do not expect India to become a permanent member in my lifetime as a diplomat. I've been handling this permanent membership since 1990s when I was the first secretary at the UN. But that doesn't mean that as an aspirational country, we shouldn't have huge, big aspirational goals. Without aspirational goals, we will not push ourselves. There is a saying in diplomacy, if you're not on the table, on the meeting table, you can be on the menu. I don't want to be on the menu, so I will push to be on the meeting table. Whether that happens now, unlikely. Whether that happens tomorrow, perhaps not. Whether that will happen day after or after some time, yes. Because that's the trajectory. We all have seen in our lifetimes how our lives have improved, how India's global standing has improved. I've seen it myself as a younger officer and much later in my life. So the trajectory is secular, that there is a improvement in the scope, but that is not a possibility right now. And all of you who think otherwise, I remember many of my journalist friends saying, oh, if anybody can get it done, you can get it done. No, I cannot. Even 4 years ago, I knew I couldn't. And I can tell you in the next 4 years also, it's not going to happen. So let's not raise our, we must have ambition, but we should not let us be deluded into thinking that's going to happen now. Order doesn't change just because there's a pandemic. Let's be clear. Order is based on power equations, and that's the global thing. As your power as a country increases, automatically you will get adjusted. Now, regarding the veto. The choice at the time when the UN was being formed was either you have a UN with a Security Council with a veto, or you don't have anything. There was no third choice. And it was put to a vote. There were 31 people who voted, 17 voted for the veto, 14 voted against the veto. And by a very razor-thin majority, it went through, because the US and Russia both said that without the veto, we don't want it. We don't want to be part of the organization. And the fear then was that, the League of Nations failed because the US wasn't there. And therefore, we need to have the US in there. And the US said, well, if you want us, we will be there only with the veto. The other argument for the veto was that if you don't have the veto and you corner a big power, what will it result in is that it will only result in another major conflagration. It won't resolve small things, but it will result in a major conflagration. That was the thinking on which even the razor-thin majority was started. But as happens in life, what starts off on a certain footing changes. Today, the veto is all-pervasive. In fact, it is an institution that you don't need to use. You can just threaten to use. You can just tell in quietly what's called a pocket veto. They will say, well, if you do this, I'm going to vote against it, and people will back off, because most people say, well, let's take 50%, let's take 60%, 100% is not possible. Now, there are many suggestions on how to curb the veto. There are some who say veto should only be allowed when there is veto by 2 countries. Then there are some who say veto should not be allowed in crimes against humanity. For example, genocide, mass killings, etc. We should not allow. As of now, Russia, China, and the US, all 3 are on one side saying no. Veto is essential. Without that, we don't see any curbs. The UK and France have not used the veto since 1989. So about, say, 30 years or so, they haven't used the veto. But that's because they all work in unison. And if somebody else is doing your dirty work, why should you soil your linen? So that's been the case. There, as I said, the situation for wanting to curb the veto has broad support today. If you put it to a vote, you will get more than 185 votes in support of the veto being curbed. But in reality, the Charter of the UN was designed never to be amended. The Charter of the UN says that for amendment, 2/3 majority is required, including all the 5 permanent members. And 3 of them are already saying no, never. So realistically, that's why people say we need different structures. Whether the old structures will meet the need or not, obviously they cannot meet the need. But there are other ways of handling it. For example, climate change is not being handled by the Security Council, or neither should it be handled by the Security Council. Because then you will be on the menu, because you're not on the table. You're there for 2 years. After 2 years, they'll put you on the menu very quickly. So there are other ways of doing it. Maybe you don't need a UN. You can work on coalitions of the willing on issues like which are of importance. For example, there may be issues which are not of importance to everybody. When the UN was discussing cybersecurity, there were about 80 countries who were interested. The remaining 100 were not interested. So you can build coalitions of the willing of those. You agree there, outside the UN, within the UN, wherever it is, and then bring it for broader support. And that's the way to go. You can use regional organizations. You can use, be more flexible and use them only issue-based coalitions. For example, if you're interested in climate change, only solar, you can have an international solar alliance. If you are interested in only resilient infrastructure, you can look at coalitions for resilient infrastructure. So you will have to be more flexible. And the UN is not be all and end all. If these coalitions with large amount of support can muster support, you can then go back and get it approved in a larger assembly. So perhaps that's the way to go about looking for commonalities among smaller groups and then working beyond that.
Thank you. The next question is from Jain Sathe, 71 ISC batch again. He feels that if the WTO cannot function properly, then it's pretty much that the UN, how can it function effectively? So should making the WTO first, independent, autonomous, powerful, work well, be the precursor to having the UN work properly? This is one. And slightly different one is, what was the global reaction to the abrogation of Article 370? And what did you have to face as the ambassador?
So about the WTO. The WTO, again, is not functioning primarily on 2 areas. One area is adjudication. And that happened for peculiar circumstances because the Trump administration allowed all the adjudicators to complete their terms, and it did not allow new ones to join. That's the one area of WTO adjudication which fell through recently after 3 years or 4 years of efforts of blocking every movement. I don't think that the Biden administration will follow that pattern. So A slow process of the WTO getting back on track is clearly visible. It may take 6 months to a year, a little bit more. They will first have to select a director general, which also got stuck because it went by consensus, and the US again blocked the Nigerian candidate who had a very wide majority. So WTO getting back on track is a easier process, but the agenda of the WTO is growing, and that's where sharp differences are there. Whether agricultural subsidies should be looked at much more seriously or not, whether data, whether e-commerce should be there or not. These are very, very tough issues, and you're not going to get agreement on these very fundamental issues because these are incipient issues where people have very strong opinions. Unless they gather together and work in smaller groups and bring back, it's going to be difficult. So if you want adjudication machinery, that will start working. But if you want expanding the agenda of the WTO, it's unlikely to happen in the near future. About Article 370. It's interesting, many of you and I are staying in Hyderabad. So many years ago, when I first went to the UN, I looked at the agenda of the Security Council. And so, believe it or not, one of the things on the agenda is the question of Hyderabad. This is on the Security Council agenda now for 70 years. And I was shocked because I had grown up here and never realized that this is a valid issue even now. However, that issue persists purely for procedural reasons. The procedure is the following, that every year, the UN Secretariat prepares a list of issues which have not been discussed during the year and says that if nobody has an objection, we will remove it from the agenda and you can bring it again back on the agenda. Now, bringing it back on the agenda is a difficult task because you have to get 9 votes in favor and with no vetoes. To bring on the agenda, there are no vetoes because considered a procedure. So what every state has done is that irrespective of whether they want an issue or not, they will ask that no, it be continued. So every year, Pakistan writes to the UN Secretariat saying, I want the issue of Hyderabad on the agenda. I was born here. I retired all my diplomatic life. Never was once Hyderabad discussed in the Security Council since 1948, but it remains on the agenda. Is a similar thing on Jammu and Kashmir, but slightly different. Issue remains on the agenda, even though it's not been discussed after 1965. 1965 was the last time the issue was discussed in the UN Security Council. In 71, what was discussed was the India-Pakistan war, but that was not on Kashmir itself. There was Bangladesh, there were others, and this was ceasefire of the 1971 war. Even that is already 50 years almost there. But the issue remains on the agenda because every year, like every other thing that Pakistan brought in its incipient stage and the UN, it continues to write and says, no, I want it on the agenda. And so they say, well, this will remain on the agenda at the request of one member state or something like that. So you're talking about vetoes of the permanent file. There's a veto of everybody there on the agenda. That said, we shouldn't be worried too much if it's on the agenda because, okay, it pricks us. It's not a happy situation, but it doesn't do anything. It's lying there. It's okay. So when Article 370 happened, China, at the behest, so China, at the behest of Pakistan, first thought, let's convene a formal meeting. And we realized that there is no support for that. And they also realized there is no support for that because there were a group of countries who said, no, this is not a matter to be discussed in the UN. That was like USA, Germany, France, Belgium. There were another group of countries who said, I don't want to take a public position on this because between India and Pakistan, if I say one, the other will get upset. So I don't want this at all. So several African countries, Some Latin American countries said, no, we don't want to discuss this in a formal meeting because it means a vote to bring it onto the agenda formally. This will be a big issue and we will either alienate India or Pakistan. I don't want to do that openly. So they came up with this new idea that, okay, let's not have a formal discussion because anyway, you put it to a vote, you will lose it because many may abstain and you have to get 9 votes. There is no way China and Pakistan get 9 votes. So they decided, well, every day we meet, we discuss everything under the sun. And China realized that many times it has been the target of such discussions because there was similar discussion on Hong Kong, there's a similar discussion on Uyghurs, there is a similar discussion on South China Sea. So it said, okay, these guys push me on that and prick me, even though there is no outcome, but they at least informally discuss this in close consultations, let's raise this. This was the quid pro quo they wanted to give to Pakistan, saying that, look, we cannot win there, but we'll have this discussion there. So we knew at the beginning that the end product is not going to be successful. But that said, we were also meeting everybody, the 15 countries, and trying to ensure that not even a word comes out. And in that, we were by and large successful because for these reasons, some didn't want to say, some were saying, well, if there is agreement of all, we will agree, knowing fully well that there will not be any agreement of all. And then there were some, like the British, saying that there's no harm if we just discuss and make a statement. There's not going to be a formal meeting because that's the only way their relevance increases. And let's be clear, the 15 on the Security Council always want their relevance to be of interest to you. Otherwise, who will bother about that? So even when you are there, you also want this thing to happen so that others will come and ask you, then you can do some trade-off on something or the other. So that was the situation, but we knew as the discussion went through, it was clear that there was nothing going to come out. We had many friends inside who were also telling us what was happening. And so I was in my office just talking to our foreign minister about what was happening, etc. So he asked me, how do you know all this? And I said, well, technology being what it is, not very difficult. And the matter ended and we thought, oh, it's done. And I just breathed a sigh of relief thinking that, oh, this is over and we don't have to worry about it. And then comes the Chinese and the Pakistanis and trying to portray to the world that they had done something big there inside. So that left us in a very difficult situation in the sense that we were not prepared for the media barrage. And I was, of course, in my office and this thing started. And then the External Affairs Minister said, oh, why are you not going to speak? And I said, I'm just so exhausted fending this off. I didn't prepare anything. So why don't you ask somebody in Delhi to speak? And he said, no, this will give a wrong message, etc., etc. So I decided, okay, I will go to the UN and also speak something. So in the 5 minutes that I had in the car, I jotted down some things, whatever I could recollect to speak. Sometimes muscle memory takes over. So that's what happened. I don't even know if you ask me today what I said, I don't know. However, it worked out well. It was just sometimes you call it chance, luck, God's grace, whatever you call it. It worked out for us. So at the end of it, we were found to be more successful in the outcome than the others were. And then they did not further try this. They tried in small ways, knowing fully well, telling us that nothing will happen, but we will try. And so that issue was laid to rest, but it will remain on the agenda. So it will remain a pinprick because none of the P5 wants to stop the others from raising anything because they want to raise something against the others at some time. So we have to start learning to live with pinpricks and not make it a do or die situation every time. It can happen the first time is a do or die situation, but it's not proper for a mature country like us to worry too much about these discussions, which are not going to lead to anything, which will not certainly have an outcome. But we are a prickly sort of a people. We don't want anybody to say anything about anything. I think as we grow up, we will learn that it's important to allow some things, focus on the big things, not worry too much about small things and small pinpricks, because even the biggest of countries will have small pinpricks. But that's part of our growing up. and the maturity of our public opinion, and we are not there yet. It will take time, I suppose.
Very insightful, very well explained. Samrita, after this question, you can look at the YouTube also. There are some questions there, but please go ahead with the next question.
Yeah. So the next question actually comes from Akhilesh Balaji. He asks, one of the principal concerns voiced by India at the UN is that of the international terrorism, specifically the state-sponsored terrorism emanating from Pakistan towards India. Do you believe the Security Council is suited aptly enough to resolve these bilateral issues? It's one. And second part to it, I'm going to add another question to it, is that, will regional organizations like ASEAN, SAARC, Quad, RCEP, etc., play a greater role in the future when it comes to peacekeeping, trade, etc., later on to resolve these issues? Yeah.
So the question on terrorism and whether the Security Council can play a role. Terrorism is defined as a crime against individuals. So ordinarily, states are not the target of counterterrorism. Counterterrorism is largely targeted towards individuals, non-state actors, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Jamaatul Dawa, whatever, Jaish-e-Mohammed, etc., etc. That's the thinking globally. They do not target states as actors in terrorism. You can call it by another name, but it is not considered a crime undertaken by the state, because terrorism is a domestic crime. So how does a state, which is the repository of moving against domestic crime, become the perpetrator? So at best, it can be state sponsoring, etc., or something. So it's like one step away. Now, we have to see the progression in terrorism or counterterrorism over the last 25 years. When I was the first secretary in 1990s, there was a killing in Kashmir of a Norwegian visitor, tourist or something, by some nondescript group, etc. And then when it was raised, nobody bothered about it, because the thinking was, this is a law and order problem, you solve it yourself, why are you thinking that this is international at all? From there to today, there's been a progression. You will not know it because you haven't seen what was the situation 25, 30 years ago. But over 30 years, there has been a progression in that aspect. True, it has not reached where we want it to reach, because to bring a state to book in a crime which is as yet not defined in international law is going to be very difficult. So that's where we are. But the progression has gone in many ways. For example, in financing. Now there are obligations of states on financing of terrorists which are tightening every time. There are other on travel, on movement, etc. Now these are not adequate. Nobody says it's adequate, but it's much better than where we were previously. So we need to understand that international law moves very slowly. It's not like national law that you pass a legislation and it's over. International law, by definition, has no sovereign authority. So there is no sanction like in national law. And it is only over decades and tens of decades that it works. That's the nature of the beast, and we all have to live with it. You can say, I don't want it. Sure. You can get 0% or you can get 20%. To get 100%, it's not possible through diplomacy. Getting 100%, there are other means. You can use war, you can use violence, etc., and all that is possible. But in diplomacy, you always have to look at suboptimal options. And we have to be realistic to know that diplomacy will always lead to suboptimal options. Very rarely, it will ensure that what you won on the battlefield is not lost. But you are not going to get very much more. You will get it enshrined, perhaps, what you won elsewhere. But don't think optimal solutions are the way in which diplomacy operates.
Thank you. There's a question from Nusir Azam. He is addressing, I think, what most of us are seeing in our WhatsApp groups, this whole business about WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram. He says data privacy might be best ensured by, some kind of a standard setting body which is independent, open, transparent. And he's wondering whether UN could be a body which can take this on.
So there are incipient discussions on data privacy. There are, even in the Western world, there are two different pathways towards data privacy right now. There is a European model, and then there is an American model. And as yet, even in the US, it's not very clear where they want to go. And then there is a model of the Russians and the Chinese, etc. And we are somewhere in between because we haven't yet formulated our views coherently on data privacy. But it is a debate that has just started. It is a debate which we are not certain whether everybody wants to join, because what they are saying is, let's all accept that the principles of international humanitarian law, which apply for other situations, also apply in the cyberspace. As a start, simple things that states should not undertake such activities, etc. Immediately the question comes, but international humanitarian law is only for situations when there is conflict. So why this is cyberspace is not an area of conflict. It is, how do you define cyberspace as only an area of conflict? Because then all rules of conflict will apply. So it's not an easy area to navigate. And states will, all of us think that internet is independent. Actually, internet is national. Any country can shut down the internet whenever it wants. It's not a transboundary issue. So given the current situation, I don't see it progressing, but there are incipient debates. It will take many, many years before we start. It's the question is, can you shut down internet or not? Countries like us say, no, we have the right to shut down when we feel it's proportionate. What is proportionate? How long can be proportionate? There will be many such issues to address before we even come to a final conclusion. So it's still some time away. But all I can say is that the discussions have begun.
Thank you. Samriddha, can we have you bring up the last question? It's 7:25.
Yeah, 7:25. The last question. Yeah, I think you actually missed the second part of the previous question that I had asked about will regional organizations like ASEAN, SAARC play a greater role in future in peacekeeping and other sorts of conversations between nations. I'm going to add a second part to another question just for now, is that it's an interesting question actually from Somashekhar. He said, since India and Pakistan have already agreed upon Shimla Agreement when it comes to Kashmir issue, what difference does it make bringing up to the UN? Is it just to bring the international attention? Yeah.
Okay. Both. First, regional organizations. Yes, many regional organizations have moved into the peace and security domain. But let me tell you, the peace and security domain is perhaps the most difficult to address. It will take maturity on the of those organizations before it becomes more acceptable. Right now, peace and security is handled in the European Union, it's handled in African Union. But other regional organizations like ASEAN have not, they are still addressing technical issues, what we call low politics. It hasn't transmuted into addressing high politics issues. So, and peacekeeping is like way down the line. Certainly for our region, we don't even do low politics. So it's going to be very difficult for our region to do it. But there are other regions in the world who think that regionalism is the way to go. Where states are broadly similar in a region, it may work. But where there are differences of huge magnitude in a region, it's not going to work. So that's the quick answer to your regional organization. Next is your question on Simla Agreement. So the argument is as follows, and this is the Pakistani argument. Our argument is that you agreed bilaterally, and so you should handle this bilaterally. Pakistan's argument is, yes, we agreed that it is bilateral, but we have two problems. One is since 71, nothing has changed. So their argument is that situation has changed. It's the same argument we use when we talk about Jammu and Kashmir, because our argument is that the first principle of international law is pact sunt servanda, which means treaties should be adhered to. The second rule is rebus sic stantibus, which means unless circumstances change. So our argument is, yes, in 46, 47, 48, we agreed to something, but you did not fulfill something, so we couldn't fulfill something, circumstances have changed, that has no relevance. Pakistan's argument is now the same on Shimla Agreement. 71 we agreed, but no progress was made. We are therefore bringing it back, because as members of international organizations, there is no way that we can always deny if circumstances have changed. That's their argument number one. The argument number two is, yes, we agreed bilaterally, but we never said what will be the outcome bilaterally. Our understanding is that, yes, we will do all these bilaterally, but it will be based on the principles of the UN resolutions. So we will still bring it back to the UN. That's their argument. But in today's reality, the differential between India and Pakistan is so much in power terms, we shouldn't worry too much about Pakistan. We have bigger fish to fry. Pakistan is, for us, a historical legacy. We shouldn't look at it as a future problem. We should look at it as a problem of the past, which we just need to manage and address and push out. There are other big challenges coming for us in the future, and we shouldn't waste too much of our time on Pakistan, but it excites all of us. When I was in the UN, every time people would say, oh, you put all these young officers who speak against Pakistan, they're carried on national television. I mean, this is not diplomacy. This is like public diplomacy. You just abuse each other, and you gain a lot of popularity within your own state. So my point is that let's not confuse public diplomacy with diplomacy, and Pakistan is an issue of the 20th century. We should not make it an issue of the 21st century.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Akbaruddin, for patiently taking so many questions. I hope you're not too tired. But there are still a lot more questions, but I think we will end here. And it was really fascinating to hear you explain all these questions in so simplistic way. Even an ordinary citizen can understand what are the forces that work on the functioning of United Nations, what are the options, and how we should be realistic in our expectations, while not being negative in our thought process. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Samriddha and Sai Kiran, for assisting me in this. May I now call upon our Secretary, Mr. Subhash Chandra Bose, to propose a vote of thanks, please.
Thank you all for joining this 145th monthly meeting of FOSWL India Hyderabad on Zoom platform. We thank the family members of Sri Enneni Jagan Mohan Rao for establishing an annual endowment lecture in his name. We also thank Dr. Ravi Rao for the annual logistics sponsorship for the month of January in the name of his mother, Srimati U. Manorama Rao. It was a pleasure and inspiring to listen to Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin's excellent talk on the topic, Is the UN Still Relevant in the Present Geopolitical Mosaic? His talk briefly delineated the growth of the multilateral system, traced its current challenges, and outlined the options available as efforts are made to chart the way ahead. This question has come to the fore more than ever in the present world situation, be it the pandemic, the growing nationalism in several countries, or wars that continue to ravage various parts of the world. We thank you, Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, for fielding our questions with such clarity and patience. We propose to continue with the Zoom meetings for the next few months till the pandemic situation abates after the successful completion of vaccination program. Our forthcoming meetings for the next 2 months are as follows. On the third Saturday, 20th February 2021, Ms. Frog Father, founder and secretary of Society to Save Rocks, will talk on the magnificent rocks of Hyderabad and how to preserve them. On the third Saturday, 20th March 2021, Justice Madan Lokur, former Supreme Court Judge, to address the problem. Once again, it was great to meet with all of you this evening. Wish you all a good and safe weekend. Good night, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you all. And
Thank you.
very nice having you on this
Thank you.
topic.